doing in sustainability. To kick this off, I'd like to introduce Manish Bapna, who is acting president of WRI. Manish joined us a little over 4 years ago. He had been with the World Bank and also with McKinsey, and he's going to get us going this morning. Manish?
Great, thank you, Robin. Good morning, everyone. I recognize that meetings at 9 a.m. in New York City aren't particularly popular, but I was not worried because I couldn't think of a more tantalizing topic to get you all than greenhouse gas accounting. And perhaps nothing more tantalizing than the release of the Scope 3 and product life cycle standards. And just to prove that, I don't know how many of you saw in the New York Times this morning that this event made the paper with the most eye-catching title, "Companies Get New Tools for Calculating Emissions." But it's a terrific piece, and I encourage you to read it. Recognizing that it's early in the morning, I thought we would play a game we often play at WRI called Greenhouse Gases Trivial Pursuit. So I'm going to ask you questions, and you're going to answer them. So first question, by what year do greenhouse gas emissions need to peak if we're going to keep global temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius? Thoughts? 2050. Yesterday. So, somewhere in between the two lies the actual answer. Anyone else? So the point of this question, of course, is to keep the end sight of why we're doing this in mind. These standards are intended to help us clearly identify and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but oftentimes one can do so in a way that is quite profitable, that unveils new innovation and new opportunity. According to the IPCC, if we want to limit global temperature increase to 2 degrees, which most people see as a threshold between being able to manage climate change and what will oftentimes be seen as catastrophic or unmanageable climate change, greenhouse gas emissions globally need to peak somewhere between the years 2000 and 2015. That's 4 years from now. And when you look at just 2010, energy-related carbon CO2 emissions actually increased by 5% to 30.6 gigatons. The IEA, another projection, says we must keep emissions below 32 gigatons. They must peak at that for energy-related carbon dioxide. The point is that we're not moving fast enough. Many governments, including ours, not acting. Those that aren't acting with sufficient ambition. The international process is kind of grinded to a halt. We really need to think about how to create greater ambition. And I think the private sector has a pivotal role to play. And I think these standards play actually an important role in helping make that happen. So my second question, this one maybe a little easier. What proportion of Fortune 500 companies currently use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate standard for measuring and reporting their emissions? What percentage of Fortune 500 companies currently use? 83 companies, 83%. Any other? Should be in the press release, I think. 50%. This is not The Price is Right. The answer is actually 2/3. And that's actually pretty remarkable. This idea started about 12 years ago, in part by a report that we helped put together with General Motors, Monsanto, and BP, called Safe Climate and Sound Business. And one of the early messages that came out of that report, one of the key principles was to measure, track, and openly report greenhouse gas emissions from their operations. This was in the year 2000, 2001. Since then, we went through the process of obviously developing the corporate standard, which was launched over 10 years ago. And now, not only do 2/3 of the companies in the Fortune 500 use it, but the Carbon Disclosure Project, at least 85% of those that report their emissions use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol in doing so. But it's not only companies, countries are also making significant progress in the uptake of the greenhouse gas protocol standards. So we see either national or sector-based greenhouse gas programs that are premised on these standards in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in Europe, Brazil, Mexico. And just to give an example, my first trip when I joined WRI a little over 4 years ago was to China. We had a meeting with the National Development and Reform Commission of China, which is the apex planning agency for the government responsible for all their energy and climate issues. We wanted to talk to them about the greenhouse gas protocol. They would not talk about it. Completely political sensitivity, gets into issues of accounting. You get immediately channeled or shifted into foreign affairs and international politics. I went there last month, tell them a little bit about what we've done more broadly at WRI. Not only did they raise, oh, we understand that you guys are the ones that are helping design these new standards, but they wanted the same senior director responsible for climate change in NDRC in China asked for a workshop from us all about the protocol and specifically about Scope 3 and product lifecycle standards. A profound shift. And when I asked kind of after the formal meeting, the director, why the shift? And she said that it's changed. It's changed from an issue that was seen as politically sensitive to one that was all about economic competitiveness. And I just think that's a very powerful shift, but it also talks a little bit about the power of the protocol. My third question, how many participants were involved in designing these standards? Many of you are here. Thoughts? Anyone know? How many? 1,300. 70. 2,300 people. 2,300 people over the last 3 years from 55 countries were involved in putting these standards together. 60 companies road tested the standards. And so I think one of the things that truly differentiates these standards is the process. We learned that with the corporate standard, that the process makes the product. And so the idea of having a global, multi-stakeholder, very, very inclusive process has been absolutely essential to the credibility and the quality of what we are about to launch. And many of the people that that have been part of it are listed in the contributors section in the standards. My fourth and final question, for Kraft or for other types of food manufacturing companies, what percentage of emissions, of their total emissions, come from Scope 3? So we had Scope 1 and 2 covered in the corporate standard. Now we did Scope 3. For this particular industry segment, what percentage of their emissions come from Scope 3? Any thoughts? 85. More or less, yes. 85 to 90% of the emissions. Incredible just how much, for many industries, the significance of the emissions that come from Scope 3. So when Kraft road tested the draft Scope 3 standards, they discovered that actually 70% came directly from the production of the raw materials that they purchased. And now they're working for greenhouse gas reduction strategies for these materials. When IKEA road tested the Scope 3 standards, they found out that the actual use of their products accounted for 20% of the emissions. And now they've put in place a target to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of the use of their products by 50% by 2015 from a 2008 baseline. When Swire Beverages road tested the product standard, they expected that the largest source of emissions would be in the production of the actual liquid beverage. But instead, they found out that refrigeration from retailers was actually the most significant source. And now they're actually providing refrigerators to their retailers that are 35 to 40% more efficient and that make major reductions in HFC generation. So just a few examples of companies that have road tested these standards, found some very interesting findings, and actually have already taken some actions to reducing them. And I think that's actually a good place. This issue that there can be a strong business case, even in the absence of a strong policy, for companies to adopt the standards, to identify opportunities for emissions reductions, to improve the bottom line. it's a good place to actually formally announce and unveil the standards. The Corporate Value Chain Scope 3 Accounting and Reporting Standard, the Product Lifecycle Accounting and Reporting Standard. And I'd like all of you who have been involved in one way or another with these standards just to stand up for a moment, and I'd like to give a round of applause to all of you who helped make these a reality. So please stand up if you were involved. So today you're going to hear much more about these standards, including from companies and groups that are already using them. You're going to hear about their experiences, what they've learned, what they're doing. I just have a few quick thanks, and then I'm going to introduce the next set of speakers. First, to Citigroup for providing us with this venue, for all the funders, supporters, and the 2,300 people. I'm not going to mention each and every one of them because that would take a while. But I do want to mention the core team from WRI and WBCSD, Pankaj, Cynthia Cummins, Laura Drucker, David Rich, and Andrea Brown from WBCSD. The five of you have been living and breathing this for the last 3 years. And just another round of applause for them for helping make this a reality. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our distinguished panelists, and I'm just going to very briefly introduce them. Thierry Berthoud is the Managing Director for Energy and Climate at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Incredible credibility to talk about these issues. In his past, he actually implemented over 1,000 greenhouse gas mitigation projects using the project accounting standard. So a lot to learn from that experience. We have Linda Fisher, the Vice President for Safety, Health, and Environment, and the Chief Sustainability Officer for DuPont. And DuPont has been just a long-term partner of WRI's for over 20 years. And I think some of our earliest engagement with the private sector was with DuPont. And I think we've both learned with each other how sustainability has evolved in this space over that time. Edwin Pinheiro, Executive Vice President, Chief Sustainability Officer of Veolia, and a company that's road-tested both of the standards, and I know has tremendous insights to share with us. And finally, Pankaj Bhatia, the Director of the Protocol with the World Resources Institute. He's been the Director since 2004. And for those of you that have followed the standards, you know there's 5 basic principles, accounting principles of the standards. Relevance, completeness, consistency, transparency, and accuracy. They're principles for the standards, but I think they absolutely epitomize Pankaj and his ability to actually lead this process. So delighted to have him speak. So let me turn it over to Thierry.